Oregon coast, winter of 1887. The ship was already sinking. A wave slammed Lydia into cold sand, half dead, barely breathing, and a stranger hauled her out of the surf. She opened her eyes, looked straight up at him, and the first words out of her mouth had nothing to do with herself. The light, it was wrong. He had no idea what she meant. But he believed her. And that was the most dangerous decision he'd ever made, because whoever put that false light on the cliff that night was already watching them both. The story of the man everyone said would die alone on his ranch until the sea brought her to his shore. Keep watching to find out what happens next. The Northern Belle was already dying when Lydia Carroll realized it. She stood at the rail with rain driving sideways into her face. One hand locked around the wet iron, the other braced against the outer cabin wall. The deck pitched hard to port. Around her, passengers who'd ventured out during the squall were scrambling back toward the doors, calling to each other in voices too high and too fast. Lydia wasn't watching them. She was watching the light. It hung off the starboard bow, through the dark and the rain, a steady, powerful glow burning against the cliffs. Her father had served the lighthouse service for 23 years. She'd grown up in stations from Tillamook to the Columbia Bar, learning light characteristics the way other children learned their letters. Cape Alder ran a repeating sequence. 2 quick flashes, a pause, one long, another pause, then again. Every experienced captain on this section of coast knew it cold. This light didn't flash at all. It burned steady and hot, and it sat too close to the water. She heard one of the sailors behind her shout over the wind, "That's not Cape Alder. That light's in the wrong place." The second sailor turned immediately and started pushing toward the wheelhouse. Neither of them made it in time. The hull hit Blacktooth Reef with a sound she felt in her back teeth, a grinding, splintering crack that traveled up through the deckboards and into her boots. The ship lurched hard. The iron rail caught her across the ribs, and then the Pacific took her. The cold was the first thing, not cold like winter air. Cold like something with intention, like the water was trying to stop her from thinking. She went under twice before her hands found a section of broken decking. She pulled herself onto it, coughing salt water, and held on. The current moved fast. In the dark, she could make out the white of surf breaking against rock, and beyond it, the faint outline of a narrow beach below a headland. She kept her weight centered on the debris and let the current work. Fighting the Pacific directly was a decision people only made once. The beach came up hard and fast. She hit sand, lost her grip on the decking, and crawled forward on her hands and knees until she was past the waterline. Then she stopped moving. Above the cliff, a light appeared. Not a false light this time, a lantern, swinging, moving toward the edge. Someone was coming down the path. Reed Halverson had been awake since 2 in the morning. A section of fence on the south pasture had come down in the wind, and he'd been out checking the line when he heard the wreck. Not the ship itself. You couldn't hear a hull strike from the ranch, but the aftermath. The rolling crack of debris hitting the reef. The way the sound changed when it reached the beach below. He took the lantern and went down the switchback path at a run, one hand trailing the rope guide his father had sunk into the rock face 30 years ago. The woman was on her knees in the sand at the edge of the surf line. Dark hair, dark clothing, both completely soaked. He got an arm under hers and pulled her back from the water. She came around faster than he expected. Her eyes opened, and she looked up at him, and her first words weren't about herself. The light was wrong. He had no idea what that meant. He was about to say so when she grabbed his sleeve and turned her head toward the water. "There's someone out there." He looked. He couldn't see anything but broken lumber and spray. "Listen," she said. He listened. Somewhere in the sound of the surf underneath it, between waves, a voice, high and cracked, calling out. "The current's running south," she said. She was already pushing herself upright, one hand on his shoulder. "If the next swell breaks south of those rocks, it'll push him left, toward the inlet mouth." He looked at her. "Go," she said. "I'm telling you where he'll be." Reed ran left along the beach. The next wave broke exactly the way she'd said. A figure came tumbling with it, small, slight arms churning, and Reed waded into his thighs and caught him by the back of his coat. The boy couldn't have been more than 15. He was shaking so hard, his teeth rattled against each other. Reed got him up onto dry sand and checked him over breathing. No obvious breaks. Cold, but conscious. "What's your name?" "Benji," the boy managed. "Benjamin Hale. I work the Northern Belle." "Cabin boy?" A nod. Reed looked back down the beach. Lydia was on her feet now, moving slowly but upright. Farther north, he could make out lights. Greyhaven fishermen already working the wreck site. Voices carried over the water. Other survivors were being pulled from the surf up the coast. Then he saw the other boats. They came around the headland faster than the fishing skiffs. Bigger. Moving with purpose. Bellamy Salvage, painted on the hull of the lead vessel in letters he could read even in the dark. August Bellamy always had his name somewhere, you could see it. The salvage crews hit the water before their hulls had stopped moving. A few of them went toward survivors. Most of them went toward cargo. Reed watched a man wade through knee-deep surf and reach into a half-submerged trunk without looking once for a person who might be attached to it. Another man came up the beach toward them, young, unhurried, like he was taking an evening walk. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Lydia with the particular attention of someone trying to seem casual. "You the lady from the passenger deck?" he asked. "You all right?" "Mr. Bellamy wants to make sure the survivors are taken care of." "She's taken care of," Reed said. The man's eyes moved back to Lydia. "She say anything about what she saw before the ship went down?" "She's been unconscious," Reed said. "She hasn't said anything." It was true enough. She'd said it before she was fully conscious, which he figured didn't count. The man looked at him for a moment, then nodded and walked back toward the wreck line. Lydia had heard all of it. She glanced at Reed and said nothing. He got them both up the switchback, path Lydia on her own feet. Benji half-carried and into Windbreak Ranch before the worst of the next squall hit the coast. His housekeeper, Margaret, had a fire going within minutes. Benji fell asleep in the chair closest to it before anyone had even found him dry clothes. Lydia sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders and both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The color was starting to come back into her face. Reed sat across from her. "What did you mean?" The light was wrong. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Then she set the mug down and told him about her father, about the years she'd spent at lighthouse stations, about the way Cape Alder's characteristic worked, and how the light she'd seen from the Northern Belle's deck wasn't it. "Someone put a light on those cliffs," she said, "in the right place to make the captain think he was farther offshore than he was. That's why he didn't correct course. You're saying someone wrecked the ship deliberately. I'm saying that light didn't get there by accident." She looked at the table. "I don't know who put it there." Reed was quiet for a moment. "You knew where the boy would end up in the current. The current patterns near that inlet aren't complicated if you know what to look for. Most people who'd just been thrown off a ship wouldn't be thinking about current patterns." She picked up the mug again. "I was raised on the water. It's what I know." Outside, the storm pressed against the windows. Reed thought about the Bellamy salvage man, asking what she'd said. He thought about the way those crews had moved straight to cargo. "Get some sleep," he said. The road to Greyhaven washed out at the lower bridge. "You're not going anywhere until morning, at least." She nodded, and for a moment, something shifted in how she looked at him. Still cautious, still measuring, but the edge of it changed slightly. He went to the back room, where his father's things were still stored in boxes along the wall. He opened the wooden one on the bottom shelf. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a torn strip of red wool. He'd found it 6 years ago, the winter after Ingrid disappeared, near an abandoned salvage shed below the cliffs. He'd kept it because he hadn't known what else to do with it, and because getting rid of it had felt like letting go of the question. He carried it to the kitchen table and unfolded the oilcloth. Then he picked up the drawing Lydia had made, a rough sketch of the coastline, with an X marking where she'd seen the false light burning. He set them side by side. The X sat directly above the stretch of cliff where he'd found the torn piece of his sister's cloak. The road to Greyhaven was gone by sunrise. Not damaged, gone. The lower bridge had taken 3 feet of mud and debris when the creek crested overnight, and what remained was a tangle of broken timber, half submerged in fast brown water. Reed looked at it in the early morning light, then looked back at the ranch, then went inside and told Lydia and Benji they'd be staying a little longer. Lydia put down her coffee cup. How long? Day or two. Maybe 3, depending on how fast the water drops. She nodded once. Then she asked where she could find a broom. Reed blinked. You don't need to. I know. I don't need to. She was already moving toward the back hallway. Where's the broom? He pointed her to the storage closet and decided not to argue about it. She worked through the morning, and Reed watched without appearing to watch. She was competent in the specific way of someone who knew exactly what they were good at and didn't try to stretch it. The floors she swept well. The breakfast dishes she cleaned efficiently. When Owen, Reed's ranch foreman, came in from the morning feed and asked if she'd mind carrying water to the horse troughs, she said yes without hesitation, and then spent 20 minutes figuring out how the hand pump worked before Owen quietly came over and showed her. She didn't get embarrassed. She paid attention, asked one question, and got it right on the second try. Benji was less useful and more comfortable about it. He sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's cat in his lap and watched everything with the alert, observant eyes of a boy who'd spent time around sailors, people who stayed alive by noticing things before they became problems. By mid-morning, the sky to the northwest had changed color. Lydia came in from the yard, looked at Reed, and said, "There's another squall coming, smaller than last night, but it'll be here by early afternoon." Owen glanced out the window. "Don't look like much yet." "It will." She wiped her hands on her apron. "The pressure's been dropping since breakfast. You can see it in the way the surf's running longer intervals, deeper troughs. It'll come in fast." Reed looked at Owen. Owen shrugged and said, "They'd better bring the loose equipment in from the east." The squall arrived at 1:30, exactly when Lydia said it would. After that, no one questioned her about weather. She helped Reed secure the rope lines on the north fence before the wind picked up, moving along the posts with quiet efficiency, tying off the same knot he used without being shown how. She'd learned knots on lighthouse supply docks, she told him, because improperly secured cargo in a coastal storm became a projectile. He filed that away alongside everything else he was learning about her. She was good with Benji, too. Not warm in a performed way, but practical and steady. She cleaned his cuts from the wreck without fussing, told him plainly which ones needed to be kept dry and which ones he'd forget about in a week, and treated him throughout like a young person, capable of handling accurate information. Benji responded to it the way people generally respond to being taken seriously. He sat up straighter. He stopped flinching every time the wind hit the windows, until Bellamy's name came up. It happened at dinner, when Owen mentioned that the salvage crews had been working the Northern Bell wreck site through the day. "Bellamy'll pull everything worth pulling before the federal man even gets a telegram," Owen said. Benji went very quiet. He moved the food around his plate and didn't look up. Lydia noticed. Reed noticed her noticing. August Bellamy himself arrived the following morning. He came in a good carriage with a driver in a proper coat, which was its own kind of statement on a ranch road that was still half mud from the storm. He was somewhere in his 50s, built solidly, with an open, decent face, and the practiced ease of a man who'd spent decades making people comfortable around him. He took off his hat when he came inside. He shook Reed's hand. He told Lydia he was deeply relieved she had survived. She thanked him. He said he wanted to make sure she was being looked after properly, and that he'd arranged a room at the Greyhaven Hotel, comfortable, private, no charge. He said he could have replacement clothing sent from the dry goods store. He mentioned a figure for travel money that was larger than Reed expected, and he said he could arrange private transportation to Portland within the week. Lydia listened to all of it. She was polite, she said. She appreciated his generosity. Bellamy smiled and asked whether any of the Northern Bell's crew or passengers had been discussing the coastal navigation on the evening before the wreck. "Just trying to understand what happened," he said. "The company would want a complete picture." Lydia looked at him. "I was below deck for most of the evening. I don't remember very much. The storm came up quickly." "Of course," he nodded sympathetically. "Terrible thing. If anything comes back to you, I hope you'll feel free to speak with me directly." "I will," she said. He stayed another 20 minutes, said everything a generous and civic-minded man would say, and left. Lydia waited until the carriage sound faded down the road. Then she turned to Reed and said, "He asked about navigation twice. I counted once. The first time was the direct question. The second time was when he mentioned the company wanting a complete picture." She set her hands flat on the table. "He's not asking because he wants to understand what happened. He already knows what happened." Reed looked at her. "I'm not going to the Greyhaven Hotel," she said. He said that was her choice. She said she knew it was. That settled the question. She stayed. Reed made clear that afternoon, while they were checking the fence damage from the squall, that she was free to leave whenever she wanted. The road would be passable in a day or two. He wasn't holding her there. "I know you're not," she said. She was examining a broken fence post, turning it in her hands to see where the wood had split. "Just making sure that's understood." "It is." They worked in silence for a while. At some point, he told her about Ingrid. He didn't plan it. It came out because they were walking the same stretch of cliff line that he'd walked alone for years. And the silence had gotten comfortable enough that words fit into it naturally. His younger sister, 22, when she disappeared. A winter storm 6 years ago. Her damaged skiff had turned up 2 days after she went missing, caught in the rocks below Cape Alder. Her body never came ashore. Lydia listened without interrupting. She didn't ask him how he'd grieved or whether he'd moved on, or any of the things people asked when they were trying to know how to feel about something difficult. She just let the information sit between them and kept walking. He appreciated that more than he could have said. That night he found the footprints. He'd gone out after midnight to check that the barn latches were holding in the wind. The ground on the east side of the house was still soft from the rain, and in the lantern light the prints were obvious boot prints, adult male, coming up from the direction of the beach path. Whoever made them had stood outside Lydia's bedroom window for long enough to press the ground down in one spot. The tracks didn't come from the main road. They came from the narrow trail that ran down to the beach and north along the cliff. The same trail that connected Windbreak Ranch to the stretch of coast directly below Bellamy's coastal property. Reed followed the prints to where the beach trail met the base of the cliff. Then he went back inside, checked the lock on Lydia's window from outside without waking her, and sat in the kitchen until first light. In the morning, he didn't tell her about the prints right away. He went and looked at them again in daylight, made sure of what he was seeing, and then told her. She stood at the window and looked at the ground below and was quiet for a moment. "He wanted to know if I was still here," she said. "Probably. Or what I might be saying." Reed crossed his arms. "The tracks go back north toward Bellamy's property." Lydia looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. They didn't need to. Benji remembered it on the second morning. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of milk and one of Margaret's biscuits, and he'd gone quiet the way he sometimes did, looking at something that wasn't in the room. Then he said, "There were 2 men." Lydia set down the kettle. "On the ship?" "On the cliff, before we hit." He turned the cup in his hands. "I was on deck getting some air because the passenger cabin smelled bad, and I saw them up on the rocks. They had something big, covered with canvas. They were moving it." "What direction?" "South, toward the reef." He looked at her. "I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was salvage equipment. I didn't think anything was wrong." "You couldn't have known," she said. "What did they look like?" He shook his head. "Dark, too far up. I couldn't see their faces." Lydia turned to Reed. He was already reaching for his coat. She sat down at the table and drew the coastline from memory, not hesitantly, but with the quick confidence of someone who'd been reading maps and sketching charts since childhood. She marked Cape Alder's position, Black Tooth Reef, the approximate location of the northern bell when it struck. Then she marked where she'd seen the false light burning. "Here's what a false beacon at this location does," she said. Reed leaned over the table beside her. "A captain coming down from the north uses Cape Alder as his reference point. He knows its characteristic, he knows its position, and he uses both to calculate his distance from the reef. If there's another light here," she tapped the mark, burning steady and strong, "it reads like a different reference point entirely. It tells him he's farther offshore than he actually is. So he doesn't correct course. He has no reason to. According to what he's seeing, he's fine." She set the pencil down. That's not an accident, and it's not a navigational error. Whoever put that light there understood exactly how coastal navigation works. Reed straightened. I want to show you something. They rode to Cape Alder that afternoon, all three of them, with Benji on a borrowed horse that was smaller and more patient than the others. The lighthouse sat on the headland above a long sloping meadow, white and solid against the gray sky, its light dark in the daylight hours. The keeper's cottage beside it had smoke coming from the chimney. Amos Reed answered the door before they knocked. He was 67, lean, with a white beard and eyes that had spent decades scanning the horizon. He looked at Lydia, looked again, and said, Lord, you look like Thomas Carroll. She smiled. I'm his daughter. I know you're his daughter. That's what I said. He stepped back and held the door. Come in, all of you. He'd heard about the Northern Belle wreck. He'd been watching the salvage work from the headland, he said, and it hadn't sat right with him from the beginning. Too fast, too organized. Lydia told him what she'd seen. He listened with the focused, unhurried attention of someone accustomed to processing important information quickly and accurately. Cape Alder runs too quick. One long, he said when she finished. Pause of 4 seconds between sequences. Every captain working this coast knows that sequence. He looked at her steadily. Could somebody imitate the position? Yes. A powerful enough lantern in the right location could make a captain think he was looking at a lighthouse. Could they imitate the characteristic? Not easily, Lydia said. Not with a standard lantern. Not at all with a standard lantern. Not precisely. He nodded once, confirming what she'd said. So whoever placed that light was counting on the captain, trusting his position, reading over his sequence recognition. In weather like that, with rain and wind, a man might see a light and think Cape Alder before he has time to check whether the timing is right. Benji was looking at everything in the lighthouse with the open curiosity of someone encountering a new world. Amos noticed and started explaining, unhurried, the way good teachers do not lecturing, just describing what things were as they passed them. Amos showed them the backup system on the way through the lamp room. It wasn't the main equipment that was the large Fresnel lens assembly, the clockwork rotation mechanism, the primary fuel reservoir. The backup lived in a separate alcove off the service room, an older emergency lamp, compact but capable, designed to mount into the surviving optical assembly if the primary failed. Next to it, a sealed kerosene locker with reserve fuel, spare wick assemblies wrapped in oilcloth, a mounting bracket system that had been standard in stations 20 years ago and could still be adapted to the current lens configuration. Old equipment, Amos said, but it works. Coast Service rule, every station maintains a usable backup. You can't leave a light dark because your primary system has a problem. Lydia studied the assembly carefully. She asked 2 technical questions about the mounting system and the reserve fuel capacity. Amos answered both. Reed stood at the lamp room window and looked north. He hadn't been inside Cape Alder since Ingrid disappeared. Lydia didn't draw attention to that. She kept talking to Amos, kept her back mostly toward Reed, gave him the room to stand there quietly without making it something that required a response. On the way out, she asked Amos about Ingrid. It came out carefully without pressure. She'd said Reed's sister had disappeared near this section of coast, and she wondered whether Amos had known her. The old keeper was quiet for a moment. He looked at Reed. Then he said, she came here the afternoon before she disappeared, asked me a question. Reed turned from the window. What question? Amos's voice was measured. She asked me, could somebody fool a ship by putting another light on the cliffs? No one spoke. I thought she was curious, Amos said. The way young people ask about how things work. I told her it was theoretically possible, but difficult to manage precisely. I explained the characteristic problem. He paused. I answered the question completely and sent her home. I've thought about it a great deal in the years since. Reed's jaw was tight. He nodded, once, and looked back out the window. Lydia said. She was already investigating. That's what I believe now, Amos said. They rode back toward Windbreak Ranch in the late afternoon light. The wind off the water was cold and clean, and the surf below the cliff ran in long, steady sets. Lydia watched the horizon out of old habit, reading the swells, checking the sky. She'd planned to continue to Portland once the road cleared. She had contacts there, work waiting, a life she'd been building. She thought about Ingrid Halverson, 22 years old, asking the right questions and not surviving the answers. She thought about Benji's hands shaking around his cup. She thought about a captain, trusting a false light, and 80-some people going into the Pacific in the dark. I'm not going to Portland, she said. Reed glanced at her. Not yet, not until we know who put that light on the cliff. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right, you're not going to argue with me? Would it matter? She considered this. No, then I won't waste the time. They came over the final rise and saw Windbreak Ranch below them, and Owen standing at the gate with a lantern, holding it up so they'd see him. He waited until they were close enough to hear him clearly. Benji's gone, he said. Lydia pulled her horse up hard. Found the back door open, Owen said. Signs of a struggle. Chair knocked over. Muddy boot prints on the kitchen floor that aren't ours. He held up something small between his fingers. And this, caught under the door frame. It was a brass wage token, small and worn, attached to a scrap of leather that looked freshly torn. Reed took it and held it close to the lantern, stamped into the metal. Simple and clear. Bellamy Salvage Crew, 7. Lydia turned the leather over in her hands. The torn edge was fresh. You could see the pale color of the inner hide where it had pulled apart. The brass token itself was dark with handling, worn smooth on the face, except for the stamp. Bellamy Salvage Crew, 7. Someone had carried this for a long time. She pressed her thumb against the rough edge. Harbor tar, she said. Owen leaned in. What? On the leather. Smell it. She held it out. That's not ranch mud. That's the black tar they use on the lower dock pilings. Whoever came through that door came from the waterfront. Reed was already at the back doorway, holding the lantern low, reading the boot prints in the kitchen floor. 2 sets coming in, 1 set of smaller prints, Benji's moving, in a way that didn't look like walking. He stood up. We go tonight. Lydia was putting her coat back on. I'm coming. Lydia. I know harbor signaling. She buttoned the coat without looking at him. I know how to move around a waterfront without drawing attention. Do you? He didn't answer that. They went separately, which was her idea. 2 people arriving together looked like a search party. 2 people arriving 10 minutes apart from different directions looked like ordinary evening business. Reed rode the main road. Lydia went with Owen as far as Tild Crane's general store, which sat on the corner where the Market Street met the waterfront road. Tilda Crane was a compact woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the specific energy of someone who processed information quickly and filed it permanently. She'd been running that store for 19 years. She knew everything that moved through Greyhaven and had opinions about most of it. She took one look at Lydia and said, you need to get somewhere without being seen. The lower warehouse district. Tilda pulled a plain, dark shawl off a hook behind the counter and handed it over. Walk like you're going home from work. Head down, steady pace. Don't stop unless I stop with you. She came around the counter. I'll show you the back way through the chandler's yard. Lydia followed her through the store's rear door without asking how Tilda knew the back way. Some things you didn't need explained. The lower warehouse district smelled like salt water, fish, and old rope. The buildings were large and dark, spaced with narrow alleys between them. Light came from a few oil lanterns on poles near the dock access, and from windows higher up where office workers were finishing their evening paperwork. Tilda pulled up short at the corner of the chandler's yard fence. There's a harbor master's notice about a weather warning, she murmured. I could walk down to that post and read it out loudly. That's the kind of thing I do ask anyone. Lydia looked at the warehouse ahead of them. 3 workers stood near the side door, talking, not paying attention to anything in particular. Yes, she said, do that. Tilda walked out into the open with complete confidence, stopped at the posted notice board, and began reading the weather advisory in a carrying voice, with editorial comments about the harbor master's handwriting. The 3 workers looked over. One of them said something to the others. All 3 turned toward the sound. Lydia went around the other side. The rear of the warehouse had a loading access with a door that sat slightly open, held by a wooden wedge. She slipped inside. It was dark and large and smelled like canvas and machine oil. Rows of shelving down the middle. crates stacked along the walls. She stood still until her eyes adjusted, then moved toward the back corner where the storage rooms were. Reed was already there. He'd come in from the dockside access and found the right room by following the single lamplight showing under a door. He had his hand on the latch when she reached him. They looked at each other. He lifted 3 fingers, pointing at the door, 3 people inside, or 3 sounds. She wasn't sure which. She nodded. Anyway, he opened the door. Benji was in the corner, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up. His coat was torn at the collar. He looked up when the door opened, and for a half-second, his face went through 3 things at once: fear, recognition, and something that finally landed on relief. He was upright before either of them could move toward him. Reed checked him over quickly, hands on his shoulders, then his face. No serious injuries. Scared and bruised and cold, but present. "Can you walk?" Reed asked. "Yes." "Good. Stay between us." They were moving back through the main floor when Lydia caught Benji's sleeve. "What did they ask you?" He kept walking but answered. "What I saw on the cliff before the ship hit. They kept asking if I could describe the men, if I could recognize them." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't tell them anything." They got out through the rear door. Tilda was waiting at the corner, arms folded, looking like she'd simply stopped to rest after her reading of the notice. She saw Benji and nodded once, the way people nod when something they hoped for has worked out. Then she led them back through the Chandler's yard. August Bellamy was standing in front of his main office building when they came out onto the Market Street. It might have been coincidence. It probably wasn't. He looked at Reed, then at Benji, then at Lydia, with an expression of measured concern. "I'm glad the boy is all right," he said. "If one of my workers was responsible, he acted completely without my knowledge or authorization." Reed looked at him. "I'll look into it personally," Bellamy said. Reed said nothing. Bellamy let it sit for a moment, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. The friendly, civic expression dropped just enough to show the edge underneath it. "Send her north, Reed. Stop asking questions. I'll keep the freight contract. I'll make sure your ranch comes through the winter." He paused. "That's a fair arrangement," Reed said. "No," Bellamy studied him. Then he put his hat back on and walked away. They got Benji to Windbreak Ranch before 10 o'clock. Margaret fed him, and he fell asleep within an hour. Reed sat at the kitchen table with Owen and Lydia, and the lamp burned low between them. That was when Lydia asked about the cloak. She'd been thinking about it since the first morning: the wooden box, the oilcloth, the torn red wool. She'd assumed Reed would explain it eventually. "He hadn't the piece of Ingrid's cloak," she said. "Where exactly did you find it?" Reed was quiet. "Reed." He looked at the table. Then he told her. "The abandoned Bellamy salvage shed, 2 weeks after Ingrid disappeared. He'd found the torn wool caught on a nail near the shed's door. He'd walked around the property for an hour, found nothing else, and eventually concluded that grief was making him see a connection that didn't exist. You suspected." "Bellamy," Lydia said. 6 years ago, I suspected. I had a scrap of cloth and a location. Nothing else. You didn't tell me. I didn't know whether it meant anything. That wasn't your decision to make." Her voice was level, not raised, but there was no give in it. "I have been standing next to a threat I couldn't fully see because you decided what information I was allowed to have." He didn't defend himself. There wasn't a defense that fit. Owen found a reason to take his coffee to the other side of the room. Lydia pushed her chair back and stood up. She wasn't done being angry, but she was finished with the conversation for the night. At the doorway, she stopped. "Show me everything," she said. "Whatever you have, whatever you've found in 6 years. All of it. Not what you think. I can handle all of it." Reed got up and went to the back room. He came out with the wooden box, the oilcloth, a folded piece of paper, with notes he'd written years ago and never shown anyone. He put it all on the table. Lydia sat back down. They went through it together. Before they finished, Benji appeared in the doorway in his socks, rubbing his eyes. He'd remembered something, he said. Something he hadn't thought to mention before because he didn't know it mattered. "The man on the cliff," he said. "The one carrying the front of the lantern frame. When he shifted his grip, I saw his left hand." Reed looked up. "He was missing a finger," Benji said. "The smallest one, on his left hand." The kitchen was very quiet. Reed set down the paper in his hand. He knew a man missing the smallest finger on his left hand. He'd known him for years, seen him on the docks, watched him run Bellamy's salvage operations with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood exactly what he was being paid to do. Silas Vane, Bellamy's chief salvage foreman. Lydia looked at Reed's face and read the answer before he said the name. The tide tables were in Amos's records at Cape Alder, and Lydia had copied the relevant figures before they left the lighthouse. She spread the paper on the kitchen table the next morning and studied the numbers with the focused attention of someone working a navigation problem. She circled one date. Here, she said, 4 days from now. Afternoon, lower than the standard range. It won't happen again for another month. Reed looked over her shoulder. What's down there at low tide? That isn't there. I don't know exactly. But tidal caves along this section of coast become accessible during extreme lows. The current patterns near the old salvage station suggest an inlet that would normally be submerged. She tapped the table. If Bellamy stored equipment near the abandoned shed, the obvious place to hide it was somewhere the water covered twice a day, Owen said, from across the room. You know how long you'd have down there? At this particular low? 40 be less. She folded the tide table. We go in fast, we see what's there, and we leave before the water comes back. Reed agreed without much deliberation. He trusted her reading on tides the same way she trusted. His reading on the land, each of them had knowledge the other didn't, and they'd stopped pretending otherwise. They went on the 4th day, in the mid-afternoon, with the sun low enough to come in at an angle off the water, and the surf running quiet and slow, the way it did, before an extreme low. Reed brought a lantern and a length of rope. Lydia brought a notebook and a small compass. They left Benji with Owen, which Benji objected to at some length, and then accepted when Owen pointed out that somebody had to watch the horses. The route in was a narrow shelf of wet rock that appeared below the cliff face as the tide pulled back. Lydia had calculated the access point correctly. Within 15 minutes of reaching the bottom of the path, a low opening in the rock face became visible, maybe 4 feet high, wide enough to enter sideways. They went in with the lantern between them. The cave opened up once they were past the entrance. It wasn't large, but it had height enough to stand, and the floor was a mixture of smooth stone and compacted sand. The smell was old salt water, and something underneath it, darker oil, rope, organic decay. Reed held the lantern up. Along the far wall, iron brackets were sunk into the rock at regular intervals. Heavy hooks, the kind that could support a substantial weight or hold a frame in a fixed position. Rust had crept down the stone face from each bracket in long orange streaks, which meant they'd been there for years. Lydia crouched near the base of the wall and ran her fingers along the stone. Oil residue. Right here at the base, you can feel the grit of it. She stood up and looked at the brackets. This is where they stored the lantern assembly between uses, hung it here to keep it off the ground and out of the water. She moved along the wall, checking each bracket, and Reed worked the other side of the cave, lifting debris, turning over pieces of wood and canvas that had accumulated near the south wall. Scattered among the debris were pieces of cargo, lengths of good rope still in their original bindings. A canvas bag with a merchant's stamp on the side that Reed didn't recognize. A brass fitting still wrapped in its purchase paper. Salvage, but not recorded salvage. Not the kind that went through a harbor master's office. He was moving a section of heavy canvas when his hand found something smaller, caught in a crack between 2 stones. He pulled it out and held it close to the lantern. A small brass whistle, short, the size that would hang on a cord around a neck, and on the side, scratched in with something sharp, 3 initials, IMH, Ingrid Margit Halverson. He stood there holding it, and the cave was very quiet, except for the water moving somewhere beneath them. Lydia came around the pile of canvas and saw his face before she saw what was in his hand. She didn't say anything. She waited. He showed her the whistle. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "She was here. She got out," he said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. She got out of the shed. She found the cave. He turned the whistle over. The road was blocked. She couldn't get to the lighthouse by land, so she took the skiff. He nodded. He stood there a while longer. Lydia didn't move away from him, didn't fill the silence with words, didn't put a hand on his arm in a way that would have required him to respond. She just stayed beside him, and the lantern burned steadily between them, and the ocean moved quietly at the cave entrance. When he was ready, he kept going. Near the back of the cave, farther in than the debris and the brackets, the wall changed texture. The stone had been marked not randomly, but deliberately, in a pattern that took Lydia a moment to understand. Horizontal cuts, groups of them, each group separated from the next by a space, and next to each group, a symbol she recognized as shorthand for a month and year. She counted the groups, 4 of them. She cross-referenced the dates against the figures she'd written in her notebook commercial. Vessels lost on this section of coast over the past 8 years. Each set of marks corresponded to a date within 2 weeks of a recorded wreck. 4 ships, she said, over 8 years. That's why no one recognized a pattern. It's too spread out to look deliberate from the outside. Reed crouched next to her. If every wreck gave him profitable salvage, he didn't need to do it often. Exactly, often enough to make money, rare enough to avoid scrutiny. She moved the lantern along the wall. The 5th mark was there. But it was unfinished. The horizontal cuts began and then stopped, the last one shallower than the rest, like whoever was making it had been interrupted, or was waiting. He hasn't done it yet, Lydia said. Reed looked at the unfinished mark. He's planning another one, she said. That's what the equipment Benji saw was for. He's not done. Reed straightened up. His voice went flat in the way of someone controlling something larger underneath. Then we go back to Greyhaven and we find Bellamy and... No, Lydia turned to face him directly. If we go to Bellamy now, he destroys this. He moves the equipment, he pays off his workers, and there's nothing left. We've seen his shed, and a cave full of old hardware, and some cargo we can't definitively connect to specific. That's not enough. It's enough for me. It's not enough for a federal marshal. She held his gaze. We need him in the act, or we need the evidence intact when the law arrives. If we move too early, he walks. He was angry. She could see it clearly. It wasn't directed at her. It was the particular exhausted anger of someone who had been waiting 6 years for an answer, and now had most of it and still couldn't act. She understood the feeling exactly. She waited while he worked through it. Finally, he said, "Then what do? We find out what he's planning. What ship? When?" She looked at the unfinished mark on the wall. "And we make sure this time someone is ready," he agreed. Not happily, but genuinely. They found the small, faded piece of red wool on their way out, trapped deep in a crack in the stone near the cave entrance, as if it had been caught there during a struggle years ago. Reed worked it loose carefully and held it alongside the torn piece he'd found at the shed. Same fabric, same color, the same cloak. Her path was complete now, from the shed to the cave to the water. What happened after that they already knew. They came back out into the late afternoon light and climbed to the cliff path. Benji was waiting at the top with Owen, as instructed. The horses were tied where they'd left them. From the top of the rise, Reed looked north. Black smoke was rising above the ridge, thick and dark and moving fast in the coastal wind. He knew before they'd gone 20 yards what was burning. The winter hay barn, the one he'd spent 4 days filling after the storm. The one that held enough feed to get the herd through January. They rode hard, but the structure was already fully involved by the time they reached the ranch. The fire had taken hold in the rear wall and moved fast through the dry hay, and there was nothing to do but contain it and keep it from spreading to the equipment shed beside it. They worked until midnight. Owen and the ranch hands, Reed and Lydia, neighbors who'd seen the smoke from half a mile away and come without being asked. Benji carried water buckets without anyone telling him to, and didn't stop until his arms gave out. When it was over, nearly half the winter feed was gone. Reed stood in front of what remained and looked at it for a long time. Lydia stood beside him. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She didn't know yet whether it would be. Instead, she said, "We're going to need to know what grade of oil started that fire." He looked at her. "The barn lamp was near the entrance," she said. "That fire started in the rear wall. And the smell when it was burning, that wasn't cheap fuel." She pulled her coat closer. "I've been around lighthouse oil my entire life. That fire smelled like high-grade illuminating oil. the kind you'd use in a precision optical system. He understood what she was saying, and what she was also saying, that knowing it wasn't enough. Not yet. One more thing they'd have to wait to prove. They fought the fire until midnight, and the cold came in off the water around 2 in the morning, and by the time the last ember was out, everyone was gray with ash and exhaustion. The neighbors who'd come to help stayed long enough to make sure the equipment shed was safe, then rode home in the dark. Reed thanked each of them by name. Lydia swept ash from the kitchen steps at dawn because she couldn't sleep and there was nothing else useful to do. Owen found her there and took the broom away without asking and told her to go inside and eat something. She went inside. She didn't eat. In daylight, the damage was clearer and worse. Nearly half the winter hay, gone. The rear wall of the barn was a skeleton of blackened posts. The surviving half of the structure smelled like wet char and would need repairs before it was fit to store anything. Reed walked the perimeter of it twice in the morning light. He didn't say much. He studied the ground near the rear wall, crouched down at the base of one post, stood up again. His face said he was thinking hard and not liking where it was going. Lydia came out and stood beside him. The barn lamp was still hanging near the entrance, she said. I checked it last night. It didn't fall. It didn't tip. Whatever started this started back here. I know, and the smell I told you about. High-grade oil. Windbreak Ranch uses cheaper fuel. I've seen the cans in the storage room. What burned in that rear wall wasn't your fuel. That's a suspicious smell and a lamp that didn't cause the fire, Reed said. That's not evidence I can take to anyone. I know it isn't. Not yet. She looked at the blackened posts, but we both know what it means. He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. The next blow came before noon. A writer from Greyhaven brought word that August Bellamy had canceled Windbreak Ranch's freight contract, effective immediately, citing a reorganization of routes. Formal, polite, completely legal. By afternoon 2 of the Murchisons, Reed had credit with sent notes saying they needed to revisit their arrangements. One of them apologized. The other didn't bother. Owen came back from town near supper time and reported that Bellamy had purchased most of the surplus hay available from nearby settlements. Not all of it, just enough to make finding replacement feed genuinely difficult before winter set in hard. Everything Bellamy did had a paper justification. Nothing could be tied to the fire. Nothing could be tied to the kidnapping. He moved through legitimate channels, the way water moves around stone patient, constant, and eventually effective. Reed sat at the kitchen table that evening with a ledger open in front of him and worked the numbers twice and got the same answer both times. Without the freight contract and with half the winter feed gone, the ranch would be in serious trouble by February. Bellamy came the following morning. He arrived alone this time, which was its own kind of statement. No driver, no associates, just a man calling on a neighbor. He sat in Reed's kitchen and accepted a cup of coffee and expressed genuine-sounding regret about the fire. He said he hoped the winter wouldn't be too hard on the herd. Then he looked at Lydia and said he wanted to revisit his earlier offer. Safe transportation north, money enough to travel comfortably, letters of introduction to employment contacts in Portland. All she had to do was leave Greyhaven. No retaliation, he said. No further difficulty. You go home. This ends. Lydia looked at him across the table. No. Bellamy's expression didn't change much. He nodded, the way a man nods when he's received information he already expected. He thanked them for the coffee and left. Reed walked to the window and watched the carriage move down the road. Then he turned around. You should consider it. Lydia looked at him. I mean it, he said. You'd be safe. Portland is far enough that Bellamy wouldn't follow. You have work waiting. You have a life that doesn't include, he gestured at the window, at everything outside it, all of this. You keep doing that, she said. Doing what? Offering me freedom whenever you're frightened. She set her hands flat on the table. Freedom includes the right to stay. He was quiet. I'm not here because I owe you something, she said. I'm not here because I have no other option. I'm here because I chose to be, and every time things get difficult, you try to unchoose it for me. She looked at him steadily. That's not protection, Reed. That's just a different kind of control. It landed the way true things land, not like an attack, but like a door opening onto something he'd already known was there and hadn't wanted to look at directly. He didn't argue. He sat down across from her and was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking if you leave, you'll be safe," he said finally. "And if I leave, you'll stop being afraid of what might happen to me." He looked at the table. "Yes, that's honest," she said. "I'll give you that." She leaned back. "But I'm not going to make myself smaller to make your fear more manageable. That's not something I'm willing to do." He let out a long breath. Then, quietly, "Then stay, because you chose it, not because you owe me anything." She nodded once. That was all she needed from him. She'd already made arrangements. That afternoon, she rode to Cape Alder and spoke with Amos, and he said yes before she'd finished explaining. There was genuine work there. Maintenance records, supply orders, light equipment, checks that his aging hands managed slowly now. She'd earn real wages, small but consistent, enough to be independent, enough to make her own decisions, without needing anyone's permission or charity. It wasn't charity she was after. It was the ability to leave whenever she wanted, so that her choice to stay meant something. Tilda came by Windbreak Ranch 2 days later with a piece of information she'd pulled from public shipping records at the harbor master's office. Bellamy had recently placed orders all separately through different suppliers, but Tilda had sharp eyes and a long memory for Bellamy's purchasing patterns. Lamp oil, heavy rope, waterproof canvas. Each order was small enough to seem routine. Together, they told a different story. "No legal salvage operation is scheduled on this section of coast," Tilda said. "I checked." Lydia looked at Reed. He looked at Owen. Before anyone could say much else, a rider came up the road from Greyhaven with a telegraph message. He'd been told to deliver it fast, he said. The line had gone down that afternoon just after it came through, and the harbor master's office wasn't sure when service would be restored. Lydia read it first because she was closest. The Columbia Queen, a passenger and freight vessel, passing Greyhaven on its southern run during the next forecasted storm system. The date on the message was 4 days out. She looked at the unfinished mark on the cave wall in her memory, counted the timing. They matched. Reed asked her to go inland before the Columbia Queen arrived. He said it carefully, in the morning, before the day had gotten busy enough to make the conversation voidable. He said he thought it would be sensible, he said. Amos could manage the lighthouse, that he and Owen and the others could handle whatever came. Lydia poured her coffee and set the pot down and said, "No, Lydia, we've done this," she said. "This is different. This is a specific night with a specific threat, and Bellamy already knows you can identify his operation. That's exactly why I need to be at Cape Alder." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Not the way a man sits when he's about to argue. The way a man sits when he's out of easy things to say and is getting down to the real ones. "I'm not only afraid Bellamy will hurt you," he said. She waited. "I'm afraid of." He stopped. Tried again. "You make decisions I can't predict. You stay when I think you'll go. You go where I think you'll stay. And I can't," he set his hands on the table. "I can't protect someone whose choices I can't control. And I've been trying to, and I know that's not. Then you have to decide," she said quietly, "whether you want a partner or somebody you can keep safe by keeping her small." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That's fair." No defense. No qualification. Just those 2 words and the willingness to sit with them. She looked at him across the table, at the honest, uncomfortable expression of a man who'd just heard something accurate about himself and chosen not to argue with it. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded. She believed him. "Portland," she said. "It doesn't feel like the only future I can imagine anymore. It hasn't for a while." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most things. "I don't know exactly what I'm imagining instead, but it isn't Portland." He reached across the table, and she let him take her hand. He held it the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. Then he leaned across and kissed her. Careful and quiet, no performance in it. She kissed him back. When it ended, they were both still for a moment, and neither of them made it into more than it was. He didn't promise her anything. She didn't ask him to. Benji was in Greyhaven that afternoon, running an errand for Owen, picking up a harness repair from the saddler on the main street, a task he was perfectly capable of managing, and that gave him a legitimate reason to be near the harbor. He wasn't supposed to go near the waterfront. He went near the waterfront. He recognized Silas Vane from 50 yards. The missing finger was unmistakable once you knew to look. Silas and another man were loading covered equipment into a freight wagon backed up to one of the Bellamy warehouses, moving deliberately, not fast, the way men move when they don't want to attract attention by appearing to hurry. Benji stayed behind a stack of lumber at the edge of the yard. He was far enough away to be invisible, close enough to watch. Workers transferred the equipment piece by piece. At one point, two of them pulled the waterproof canvas back to reposition a load, and Benji saw what was underneath. Two large hooded lantern assemblies, heavy framing. One of them looked familiar in the particular way. Something looks familiar when you saw it once in the dark and hoped you'd been wrong about it. He started back toward the saddler's shop, and a hand came down on his shoulder. He ran. He knew the harbor layout because sailors talked, and he'd listened which passage cut between which buildings, which yard had a gap in its fence, where the narrow space between the rope storage and the fish house let a person through and didn't let a larger person follow. He went through all of it fast, with boots behind him, getting closer, and then not closer. One pursuer caught his coat at the gap in the fence. The sleeve tore. Benji went down on one knee on the stones, scrambled up, kept going. His ribs screamed where the fence post had caught him. He made it back to the main street with a torn sleeve and bruised ribs and his heart hitting the inside of his chest like it wanted out. He found Owen at the saddler's shop and said he needed to get back to the ranch. Owen looked at the sleeve. He hitched the horse immediately. At Windbreak Ranch, Benji sat at the kitchen table with Reed and Lydia and told them what he'd seen, both assemblies, the framing, the size of the setup. Lydia went still. Two lights, Benji nodded. She turned to Reed. One light lets you fool a captain about his position. Two lights lets you create an entirely false reference system. He can make the Columbia Queen's captain think the entire coastline is somewhere it isn't. She was working through it as she said it, and her voice was flat and focused. That's not just moving one reference point. That's replacing the geometry of the whole approach. Reed said, "How do we stop it?" She didn't answer immediately because an answer was forming, and she wanted to be sure of it before she said it. Cape Alder, the emergency lamp Amos had shown them, the backup mounting system, the reserve fuel, the spare wicks stored separately, all of it, sitting in that alcove off the service room, exactly as Amos had described. If someone sabotaged the main lamp, the official light would go dark. A captain coming down the coast in a storm. Seeing darkness where Cape Alder should be and two steady lights below, he'd follow the lights. Unless someone put the true light back. She was still working out the details of it when the sound came from outside. Glass breaking. Then a thud. Somewhere on the lighthouse road, closer than that. Reed was on his feet before she'd placed it. A rifle shot. Single, distant, from the direction of the lower road. They waited. 5 minutes later, Owen's horse came up the ranch road at a trot, saddle empty, reins dragging. There was blood on the saddle leather, still dark and wet. They found Owen a quarter-mile down the road, sitting against a fence post with his hand pressed to his left side and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who has decided not to make noise about pain. The wound was through the fleshy part below his ribs, deep but not fatal if it stayed clean. Reed got him up and onto the wagon, and Margaret had him on the kitchen table within 20 minutes, doing the kind of steady, efficient work that reminded everyone why she'd been at Windbreak Ranch for 15 years. Owen caught Reed's arm before he could step away. "Bellamy's men," he said. "Moving equipment, Cliff Road, heading south toward Black Tooth." He breathed carefully around the pain. Two wagons, the lantern frames Benji described. They're not waiting for the storm to set up. They're going tonight. Reed was already thinking about the road to Bellamy's coastal property, about how long it would take to ride there and what he'd do when he arrived. Owen read it on his face. He kept his hand on Reed's arm. "That's not what Ingrid was trying to do," he said. Reed looked at him. "She wasn't going after Bellamy," Owen said. "She was going to warn people. People who had no idea they were in danger." He let go of Reed's arm. "Don't turn away from that now." Reed stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then he went and got his coat. Lydia was already at Cape Alder. She'd ridden there the moment they brought Owen in because she'd understood before anyone said it plainly. If Bellamy was moving the false lanterns to Blacktooth Cliff, The lighthouse was the next target. You couldn't run two false lights convincingly with Cape Alder's authentic signal still operating. The true light had to go dark first. It had gone dark an hour before she arrived. The door to the lamp room was hanging open. Amos was sitting on the floor of the service room with a cut above his ear and his hand pressed against it, upright and conscious but pale. He'd tried to stop them. There had been 3 men, he said. They were thorough and they were fast. The primary lamp was destroyed, the burner assembly cracked, the fuel reservoir contaminated with seawater. The clockwork rotation mechanism had a piece of its drive gear broken off, and without the right part, it couldn't be repaired before morning. The telegraph wire had been cut at the base of the pole outside. Lydia helped Amos to his feet and got him to the chair in the service room. She checked the cut on his head shallow, but head wounds bled impressively and got a clean cloth pressed against it. Then she went to the alcove. The emergency lamp was there. The reserve kerosene locker was there, sealed and undisturbed. The spare wick assemblies in their oilcloth wrapping, the mounting bracket system on the shelf above. Everything Amos had shown them, exactly where he'd left it. They hadn't found it. They hadn't even looked for it, because they didn't know it existed. She carried the emergency lamp out and set it on the service room table. Amos, can you walk me through mounting this? He looked up from the cloth pressed to his head. The bracket connects to the optical frame at the secondary ring. There's a locking pin on the left side. His voice was steady. This was his lighthouse, and he knew every inch of it. I can't climb the service ladder right now, but I can tell you exactly what to do. Then tell me. It took 40 minutes. Amos talked her through each step: the bracket alignment, the locking pin, the wick assembly, the precise fill level for the reserve kerosene. The primary Fresnel lens was undamaged and still seated correctly in its mounting. The emergency lamp wasn't as powerful as the original, but with the surviving optical system directing the light, it would carry. The problem was the rotation mechanism. Without it, the light would be fixed, rather than revolving. A fixed light couldn't reproduce Cape Alder's published characteristic automatically. Lydia stood at the lamp room window and looked at the dark water below. Somewhere out there, the Columbia Queen was running south in the building storm. I'll do it by hand, she said. Amos looked at her. You'd have to count the intervals and control the exposure manually, in sequence, for as long as the ship needs to correct course. I know Cape Alder's characteristic. Too quick, one long 4-second pause. She looked at him. How long since you taught me that? He almost smiled. Your father taught you that. Below the lighthouse, Reed was riding hard. He'd gathered people the way you gather people in a small coastal town when the threat is finally visible and everyone has been quietly waiting for permission to act. Ranch workers, fishermen who'd watched Bellamy's salvage crews work wrecks for years and understood what they were really watching. Cannery laborers, several of the Northern Belle survivors who'd stayed in Greyhaven while their circumstances sorted themselves out. Benji had told them about the 2 lantern assemblies, and that information moved through the group and changed their faces. Tilda Crane came out of the general store with a lantern in one hand and said she wasn't staying inside. Nobody told her to. Benji rode beside Reed on the patient, borrowed horse, and explained as precisely as he could where he'd seen Silas directing the wagons. Reed listened and adjusted their route. The cliff road south of Cape Alder was narrow enough that 2 wagons moving carefully would leave clear tracks even in the dark. They found the tracks. They followed them to the position above Blacktooth Reef. The 2 lantern assemblies were already in place on the cliff face, mounted on their frames, burning steady and strong against the storm. In the dark and the rain, from the water they would read like reference points. A captain running south would see them and calculate his position from them, and that calculation would put him on the reef. Silas Vane was there. 8 of Bellamy's men were there. August. Bellamy stood back from the cliff edge in a dark coat, watching the water. Reed stepped into the lantern light with Greyhaven behind him. Bellamy turned around. He took in the crowd: the fishermen, the ranch workers, the cannery men, Tilda with her lantern, Benji on his horse. His expression moved through several things in quick succession and landed on something controlled and cold. He told Silas to handle it. Silas looked at the people across from him. Then he looked at the men beside him. Some of them he'd worked with for years. Some of them had brothers in the crowd across the cliff road. One of them had his father-in-law standing next to Reed with a boat hook in his hand. Silas raised his rifle. One of Bellamy's workers lowered his, not dramatically, just quietly set the barrel toward the ground and stepped back. Then another one. Bellamy's voice went sharp. He told them to hold the line, told them there would be consequences, told them they knew what they owed him. The words came fast and certain, the voice of a man who had always been able to count on economic necessity to do what direct orders couldn't. It didn't work. These men had families in Greyhaven. They bought supplies from Tilda's store. Their children went to the same school as the cannery workers' children. Bellamy had always assumed that dependence created loyalty. What he'd miscalculated was the difference between dependence and allegiance. Silas was the last one, still holding his rifle up. He looked at the people across from him for a long moment. Then Reed said his name, quietly, and something in Silas's face gave way. He set the rifle down. Bellamy ran. At Cape Alder, Lydia saw the Columbia Queen's running lights through the rain. She pressed her hands against the lamproom glass for a moment, then went to the emergency lamp and began. 2 quick flashes. Pause. 1 long, 4-second pause. Again. She counted in her head, controlled the exposure by hand, kept the sequence exact. Her arms ached within 10 minutes. She didn't stop. Amos sat in the corner, counting intervals aloud, steady as a metronome, so she could match his timing without losing the sequence. His voice was calm. It helped. The Columbia Queen's lights shifted, barely at first, then more clearly. The captain had seen the true characteristic. He understood that the 2 steady lights below were false, because a ship captain who knows Cape Alder's published pattern knows it can't appear in 2 places at once, and it can't burn steady. He slowed the vessel and began correcting course. The Columbia Queen passed Black Tooth Reef with water to spare, but not much. Lydia didn't stop until the ship's lights were well clear of the rocks and moving into safe water. Then she sat down on the service room floor and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The Columbia Queen cleared the reef at 11:30. Lydia stayed on the service room floor for about 30 seconds. Then she got up and checked the emergency lamp and made sure the reserve fuel was feeding correctly and went to the window to watch the ship's lights move south into safety. Amos said, from his chair, "Your father would have done exactly that." She didn't answer. She was watching the water. Below on the cliff road, the situation had finished resolving itself by the time Reed sent 3 men down the beach path to check the false beacon positions. They came back with what they'd found the lantern frames still in their mounting brackets, the oil supplies in waterproof containers beside them, the canvas coverings folded neatly nearby, transportation equipment, tools, and in the larger of the 2 canvas packs, cargo identifiable by its merchant stamps and documentation, goods from the Northern Belle, never reported to the harbor master's office. One of the fishermen held up a brass fitting still in its original wrapping. "I know this marking," he said. "This came off the Belle. I watched Bellamy's crews pull this section of cargo the morning after the wreck. That was the piece that connected everything. Not just the false lights, not just the lantern frames, not just the waterproof canvas. Stolen cargo from a ship Bellamy had deliberately wrecked, sitting in his equipment pack on the cliff above the reef he'd wrecked her on." Silas offered no resistance when Reed's men secured him. Several other Bellamy workers sat down on the rocks and said they were done. The ones who agreed to cooperate would say so formally when the federal marshal arrived, and everyone present understood that night that the marshal would arrive, because there were too many witnesses and too much physical evidence for the story to disappear. Bellamy had gone south along the cliff when he ran. Reed followed. The path narrowed above Blacktooth Beach, dropping toward the inlet where the tidal cave sat below the cliff face. Reed had walked this ground most of his life. He knew where the footing went soft near the edge and where the rock was solid, and he moved faster than a man who didn't know it could. He found Bellamy at the inlet. The man had stopped at the water's edge. Out of path, nowhere left to go, except the rocks and the surf below. Reed stopped 10 feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm had eased slightly, enough that the surf was loud but not deafening. The water below caught the partial moonlight between clouds. "What happened to Ingrid?" Reed said. Bellamy looked at him. He was breathing hard from the run, but he wasn't afraid in the simple way Reed might have expected. He was calculating, still working the odds even now. "Answer me." Bellamy said nothing for a long moment. Then something in his calculation shifted. Maybe he recognized that this was a question Reed would stand there all night waiting to hear answered, and he said, "She wasn't supposed to die. Vane was supposed to keep her in the shed until the ship passed." Reed stood very still. "She was too clever," Bellamy said. "She'd worked out most of it. I don't know how." He said it with a trace of something that might have been professional respect, which was the most chilling part. "We needed her quiet for one night. That's all. She got out," Reed said. "Yes, and then she took the skiff." Bellamy didn't answer that. "He didn't need to. I never told anyone to kill her," Bellamy said. Reed looked at him. "You didn't have to." Bellamy moved then, trying to step around Reed along the wet rock toward the wider path north. It was a careful, reasonable attempt. Not aggressive, just a man trying to find an exit. A wave came up the inlet faster than either of them expected. It hit the rock shelf, and the spray caught Bellamy's footing, and he went sideways into the surf. The inlet was deep on the south side. The current ran circular, which Reed knew, and Bellamy didn't. Bellamy went under once, and came up and went under again. And when he came back up, he was already 5 yards from the rock face. Reed stood at the edge. He could watch. He could simply stand there, and the Pacific would settle 6 years of grief and rage and unanswered questions, and no jury in the territory would call it murder. He reached back and uncoiled the rope from his shoulder. Threw it. Bellamy missed it. The current pulled him another yard. Reed pulled the rope back and threw it again. Bellamy caught it. Reed dragged him in, hand over hand, until Bellamy could get purchase on the rock and pull himself out. Bellamy lay on the stone shelf, coughing salt water and looking up at Reed with an expression that couldn't quite find its footing between confusion and something bleaker. Reed didn't explain himself. He pulled Bellamy to his feet and walked him back up the cliff path. He hadn't forgiven him. He hadn't decided that any of it was acceptable, or that the years of grief were balanced by a rope thrown in the dark. He'd thrown the rope because he refused to deliberately allow another preventable death on this stretch of coast. That was all. It was enough. The formal accounting came 2 weeks later, from one of the older salvage workers. Patrick Doyle was somewhere past 60, weathered in the specific way of men who'd spent their lives working coastal waters, and he'd been in Bellamy's employ for most of his adult life. He came to the federal marshal's office in Greyhaven on his own, without being sent for, and sat down and said he had something to tell that he should have told 6 years ago. He'd been a young deckhand in Bellamy's operation the night Ingrid Halverson disappeared. He'd seen her escape the salvage shed. He'd watched from the shelter of the inlet as she reached a skiff and pushed off toward Cape Alder. A breaking wave overturned the boat in the inlet mouth. Doyle had watched Ingrid thrown clear of the skiff and carried by the current beyond the overturned hull. He and another man had searched part of the shoreline the following morning. They'd found pieces of the boat. They hadn't found her. He'd been silent for 6 years because he was afraid of Bellamy and because he'd told himself that speaking wouldn't bring her back. He said both things plainly, without trying to make them sound better than they were. His account went into the official record alongside the physical evidence, alongside Silas Vane's eventual cooperation, alongside the Columbia Queen officer's testimony and Amos's statement and Benji's identification. The federal case was built from all of it together, and no single piece of it depended on what Bellamy had said to Reed on the cliff. Reed read Doyle's testimony when the marshal shared it. He sat with it for an evening. Then he went to the shelf where he'd kept Ingrid's whistle since finding it in the cave, and he held it for a while. And he understood finally and completely what she'd done and why, and how it had ended. She'd known. She'd figured it out, and she'd gone to Cape Alder to warn people she'd never met, in a storm, by herself, because she was 22 years old, and that was what she'd decided was right. She hadn't made it, but someone else had. At dawn, Reed walked to the family grave marker at the edge of the south pasture. It had stood for 6 years with her name on it and no certainty beneath it. He set the brass whistle in the small hollow at the base of the stone, where the morning light would find it. The marker still stood for morning. Now it also stood for something answered. Winter let go slowly on the Oregon coast. It didn't happen all at once, it never did. The storms spaced themselves out through February, and then came less frequently in March. And by April, the headland above Blacktooth Beach had its first thin green along the cliff edge, and the surf ran blue instead of iron gray in the afternoon light. Windbreak Ranch survived. The hay that Greyhaven families brought in wagons the morning after the Columbia Queen incident carried the herd through January. The Bellamy freight monopoly dissolved fast. Once Bellamy himself was in federal custody, and his business arrangements stopped being backed by consequence. Reed negotiated new contracts on his own terms quietly with merchants who'd wanted independent arrangements for years and hadn't previously been able to manage them. By spring, the ledger looked better than it had in a long time. Greyhaven changed more slowly, which was appropriate. The cannery was sold to new ownership by spring. Several merchants established their own shipping relationships. Henry Maddox, the entrepreneur who'd been aboard the Columbia Queen and survived the near wreck, specifically because Lydia had kept Cape Alder's light running, returned to Greyhaven in February and opened the competing freight operation that Bellamy had tried to sink along with his ship. He hired 14 people from Greyhaven on his first day of operation. The town didn't become instantly prosperous. It became economically healthier, which was different, slower, and more durable. Owen healed clean, which Margaret credited to her nursing, and he credited to stubbornness, and both of them were probably right. He was back at his full duties by late February, moving only slightly more carefully on the stairs than he had before. Amos stayed at Cape Alder, but began talking about retirement in the particular way of someone who started to believe it might actually happen. He was training Benji in earnest now, not casually, not as a favor, but formally, with the systematic patience of a man passing on a craft he'd spent 50 years learning. Benji took to it with the complete, unself-conscious absorption of someone who has found the thing they were made for. Tilda Crane continued running the general store. She continued knowing everything that moved through Greyhaven. She continued having opinions. Nobody expected any of that to change. The federal marshal's office in Portland sent word in March. August Bellamy had been convicted on conspiracy, maritime sabotage, theft associated with wrecked vessels, and attempted murder, along with several related federal charges. The sentence was structured to ensure he would remain imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. The judge's written decision noted the number of lives risked across 8 years of deliberate wrecking operations and was not gentle about it. Silas Vane received a lengthy sentence of his own. Patrick Doyle, who'd cooperated fully and whose testimony had anchored the case's account of Ingrid's death, received consideration from the court in return. He was not absolved, but he was free. Reed read the official notice at the kitchen table. Then he folded it and put it in the wooden box alongside the oilcloth and the torn red wool and the notes he'd written in his worst years of grief and uncertainty. He closed the lid. He didn't put it away. He left it on the shelf where it had always sat, but he stopped opening it. The Portland Telegraph office sent Lydia a formal renewal of their employment offer in late March, the second time they'd written since the Northern Bell incident. It was a good position, honestly offered. The compensation was fair. She also received a settlement related to the Northern Bell disaster, not a large figure, but real money, enough to travel comfortably and establish herself somewhere new if she chose. She had wages from Cape Alder coming in monthly. She had no debt to anyone. The threat that had kept her in Greyhaven was gone, the man responsible for it imprisoned, and the federal case closed. For the first time since the Pacific threw her onto Blacktooth Beach, there was no practical reason she had to stay. She hadn't told Reed about the Portland letter yet. She wanted to decide for herself before the conversation happened, because she'd learned early that decisions made in response to other people's feelings weren't really decisions at all. Reed found out about it anyway. Tilda mentioned it, with no particular malice, just the reflexive information sharing of a woman who'd spent 3 decades in the middle of a small town's business and saw no reason to stop now. He came home that evening and helped Lydia with the evening chores and ate dinner and was quiet in the particular way that meant he was working toward something. After dinner, he said, "I'll drive you to Greyhaven in the morning. You should be able to make the Portland coach by midday if we start early." She looked at him. "I haven't said I'm going, I know." He got up and started clearing the table. "But if you are, there's no reason to delay it." She watched him move around the kitchen for a moment. He was giving her the clearest possible road out, and it was costing him something visible. She could see it in the careful, deliberate way he was occupying himself with ordinary tasks. In the morning, he loaded her trunk into the wagon without being asked. They drove toward Greyhaven in the early light with the coast visible to the west, the surf running low and calm. The road passed below the Cape Alder headland, and at the junction, where the lighthouse road turned north, Lydia said, "Stop." He stopped the horses. She looked at the lighthouse road. Then she looked at the Greyhaven road. Then she said, "I'm not taking the Portland coach." He was quiet. "I've negotiated an expanded arrangement with Amos," she said. "More hours, more responsibilities, a wage that covers my expenses independently. I've also arranged a small room near the lighthouse for nights when the road back to the ranch is unsafe in bad weather." She watched his face. "I've built something here that doesn't depend on you. A life I chose, not one I fell into." He nodded slowly. "And I want Windbreak Ranch to be my home, too," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "The sea brought me here," she said. "It didn't make me stay." Something in his face went quiet and settled. He said, "I know. That's the part that matters." He reached over and took her hand. She let him. Then he asked, simply and directly, whether she wanted to build a future with him. She said yes, just that no speech, no qualification. The same way she made most decisions once they were actually made. They married in July, above Blacktooth Beach, on a clear morning when the Pacific was flat and blue, and the headland grass had grown up tall along the cliff edge. The ceremony was small enough that everyone present could hear every word without straining. Amos stood with his hat in his hands and his white beard combed properly for the occasion. Benji wore a new coat and stood very straight, because Amos had told him that a lighthouse keeper's apprentice should conduct himself with dignity at important events, and Benji took such instructions seriously. Owen gave Reed away with more jokes than Reed appreciated, which was exactly the right number. At the wedding supper in the early evening, Tilda Crane looked across the table at Reed with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and intends to enjoy it fully. "Well, Halverson," she said, "seems you're not going to die unmarried after all." Reed glanced toward Lydia. Apparently, the Pacific had other plans. Lydia heard him from across the table. She shook her head. "The Pacific only introduced us," she said. That evening, they walked down to Blacktooth Beach. The sun was low and orange over the water, and the tide was out, running in slow, quiet sets along the sand. Reed carried his coat over one arm. Lydia walked beside him without her shoes, carrying them in one hand, her feet in the cold, wet sand at the waterline. She stopped at the spot where he'd found her, 8 months earlier unconscious, half frozen, barely alive. The spot where the current had put her down, and Reed had pulled her clear of the surf. She stood there and looked at the water. She'd had nothing then. No home, no money, no choice about where the current carried her. Now she had work she was good at, wages she'd earned, a room that was hers, friends she trusted, and a man who'd genuinely learned, not just agreed, to that loving someone meant accepting their choices, even when those choices were frightening. She remained anyway. Across the water, Cape Alder began its sequence in the early dusk. 2 quick flashes. Pause, 1 long, 4-second pause. Then again. The true light, moving out over the darkening sea, marking the coast for every ship running south. Lydia reached for Reed's hand before he reached for hers. He looked at her. She looked at the lighthouse. Behind them stood Windbreak Ranch, solid on the headland. To the north stood Cape Alder, its light already crossing the water in its steady, reliable pattern. Neither place was a prison. Both were part of a life she had built and chosen and could leave whenever she wanted. She had no intention of leaving. They turned away from the ocean together and started walking home. The beach was cold and clean, and the light moved behind them over the Pacific. The sea had brought her to his shore by chance. Everything after that was choice. There's a moment near the end of this story that I keep coming back to. Reed loads Lydia's trunk into the wagon. He drives her toward Greyhaven. He doesn't ask her to stay. He doesn't propose before she decides. He just drives, because he finally understood something that took him the entire story to learn, that loving someone means trusting their choices, even when those choices terrify you. That moment is the whole story, really. Everything else, the shipwreck, the false lights, the villain, the mystery, all of it existed to bring two people to that single junction in the road where Lydia looks at the lighthouse and looks at the Greyhaven road and chooses for herself. And she stays, not because she has to, not because she owes Reed anything, not because she has no other option. She stays because she built a life in Greyhaven that belongs entirely to her wages, her work, her room near the lighthouse, her friendships. She stays because leaving is genuinely available to her, and she picks this shore anyway. That's the first thing this story is quietly teaching us. Freedom isn't just the ability to go. It's the ability to stay on your own terms. There's a difference between being trapped somewhere and choosing somewhere, and that difference is everything. Lydia understood that a choice only means something when the other options are real. So she made sure they were real before she chose. The second thing this story teaches us is about the particular kind of courage it takes to be honest about your fear. Reed wasn't a coward. He was a man who had lost his sister to a grief that never fully answered itself. And for 6 years, he'd managed that loss by controlling what he could control. When Lydia showed up making decisions he couldn't predict, staying when he thought she'd go, walking into danger because she believed it was right, she didn't fit inside his way of managing things. And instead of admitting that, he kept offering her exits. He kept calling it protection. It took Lydia saying it plainly. That's not protection, Reed. That's just a different kind of control for him to actually look at what he was doing. And then he did something harder than fighting Bellamy or riding into a storm. He sat with the truth about himself and didn't argue with it. He said, "That's fair," and meant it. That kind of honesty, the kind that doesn't make excuses for itself, is rarer than physical courage and harder to find in fiction and in life. The third thing this story leaves with us is about community. Bellamy's greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating Reed or Lydia. It was believing that economic dependence created permanent loyalty. He thought because Greyhaven needed him, Greyhaven belonged to him. What he forgot, or maybe never understood, is that people are not their circumstances. When the moment came, and Bellamy ordered his own men to fire on their neighbors, and brothers and fathers-in-law, they set their rifles down. One by one, quietly, not dramatically, just done. That's how real communities hold together, and that's how real corruption finally collapses. Not in one dramatic confrontation, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary people deciding that enough is enough. This is a story about a woman who chose her shore. But it's also a story about what it means to love without controlling, to stay without owing, to grieve without being consumed, and to trust that the right things we do, even when they cost us everything, have a way of continuing without us. The sea brought her there by chance. Everything after that was choice. And maybe that's the most honest thing any story can say about a life worth living. This story is a work of historical fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional and created for storytelling purposes only.